Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is a discussion of the first chapter of the Critical Digital Literacies, a Social Praxis book. That's quite a mouthful. As is the title of this chapter, Designing Space for Student Choice in a Digital Media Studios Classroom. The author is one Anne. Anne Schmier. I think she's got Stephanie Anne Schmier. I'm sorry. And there's quite a lot of interesting topics to talk about this. I think this is a great chapter to start this book with because we see a lot of what I would consider to be good critical digital literacy work here, critical pedagogy, as well as critical research. You notice the author doesn't try to hide herself and hide her feelings and beliefs, possible limitations of the study. She seems very sincere about things that she likes and things that she dislikes. So she's not trying to be quote unquote objective with this, which I think kind of gets us into this idea of what it would mean to be critical, not just critical in the classroom, but critical when you go to a classroom. It's what you see there and sort of the beliefs you bring to the table, and all this kind of stuff is here so we can judge for ourselves what we make of this. Schmier opens with she doesn't open with this, but she bases a lot of her research on her theoretical framework on someone named Janks, who's done some work in critical literacy for, I believe it's Educational Review journal. Anyway, Janks he talks about design, and he says design without an understanding of how dominant discourses perpetuate themselves actually runs the risk of an unconscious reproduction of those forms. So this is a pretty interesting thought. This is largely one of the reasons why at universities like St. Cloud State, we want to have professors teaching courses and not professors that are aware of, say, Foucault or all of these other sort of critical theorists who have brought to light this idea of an ideology and hegemony, all this sort of white privilege and whatnot that may be perpetuated in ways not just directly, but very subtle ways. And being aware of how that transmission works can make us a lot more effective in the classroom, not just saying, well, here's how to use Photoshop, or here's how to make a PSA, but also making students aware of these sort of under the level, what's the word? They're sort of, I don't want to say subterranean, but subconscious, I guess, ways they might be reproducing inequality. Not that they want to, they just might not be aware of it. So this is a good place to start, I think. Thinking about this PSA that was a Cardenas, I believe, had his students make, and we can decide how that went. I think after reading the Ron Sierra book, somebody had said, I think it might have been Jay, had been talking about how there's certain things that he thought that Ron Sierra would approve of with this project, but maybe other things that were not so, or that Schmier anyway seemed to disapprove of. So we can get into that a little bit more. We also have a definition of literacies that I think is important for us. Notice, first of all, we're not talking about literacy as though that was just a singular thing. There's only one type of literacy. Some people think you're either literate or you're illiterate, right? There's just two extremes. And that's a rather simplistic view, right? I mean, there's so many different kinds of literacy out there, and it's not an all or nothing deal. It's not a simple notion, really, when you start thinking about it. So here we have literacies should be understood as socially situated. That's key, as well as discursively constructed practices that vary in relation to the activity of which it is a part. So I got this little picture here that I found on Google. One of these sort of simplistic notions, memes, if you will. 1 in 7 U.S. adults are functionally illiterate. That sounds like a crisis, right? But it's actually kind of a simplistic thing. What do they mean by, what is their definition of functionally illiterate? What are they talking about there? It's this kind of like this meme is suggesting that we can all agree on what it means to be literate, which definitely not true, right? It varies depending, as this quote says, on your social situation. People in one community might have a different standard than people in another community. It doesn't mean that they're less able. It just means that there's different understandings of this, right? And furthermore, literacy is not a scientific measurement per se. It's a discursively, I guess you could say, a social construction of what it means to be literate or what it means to be educated, let's say. This is not something you could measure objectively, like you could say economic factor. There's a lot of subjectivity, I guess I would say, that goes into this thing. That's what they're trying to make us aware of here. Sometimes what passes for literacy or education is actually damaging. And coming back to this for a second. So, for example, think about all those Native American children that were told they couldn't speak their native language and they had to speak English because they were illiterate if they didn't know, quote unquote, proper English. So that's the kind of thing that you want to be wary of when you're embracing one of these simplistic definitions of literacy. We also have here, I was trying to figure out, well, Schmier kind of criticizes some stuff about Cardenas' project, Mr. Cardenas. So I was trying to figure out, well, what would she consider to be an ideal project? She talks about a multiliteracies pedagogy. One aspect was that instead of working alone, Mr. Cardenas would have had, I guess, a little group that he met with of other faculty, as well as coordinating with students. But anyway, she defines multiliteracies pedagogy as something wherein students and teachers engaged in multimodal design create communities of learners who critically inquire into the historical, cultural, and social nature of particular systems and practice in order to transform knowledge for their own purposes. So the goal with this kind of project would be the students will reconstruct new narratives and position themselves as authors and designers of their own social futures. So I think when we looked at that PSA project that Mr. Cardenas had put together, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but you could think about yourself. How would you, if you wanted to have a PSA project in your classroom and you wanted to do all of these things, how would you go about it? Can you make students critically inquire into things? I think Rancière would approve of this idea of a community of learners, right? At least if we understand that as they're all equal, they all consider each other to be equally intelligent. The teachers consider themselves equally intelligent with the students, and so on. And can you be honest about what you see? Can you talk about what you make of things? So it's sort of interesting. I'm sitting here trying to imagine what Rancière would make of this quotation here. Would he agree with this idea or not? I guess it would depend on whether the teacher, to Mr. Cardenas, perhaps a Schmier, set themselves up as masters, people who already know what's really going on with this dominant discourse, and they're teaching these poor students who otherwise would be ignorant for the rest of their lives without the teacher's guidance. Is that what's going on? Because Rancière would clearly not agree with that. Or am I, maybe that's just completely missing the point of this activity, or of multiliteracies pedagogy. Maybe this is in fact saying, no, actually it's the opposite. We need to respect and legitimate what the students are bringing to the table. Their contributions are equally valuable. But the history and the culture and the social nature of it has to come from somewhere, right? So I guess it would depend on how do they go about this critical inquiry. So I'll hand it over to you at this point, let you respond to this idea of a multiliteracies pedagogy and where you think Rancière might come down on this. Okay, so moving on a little bit more deeper into the critical literacy idea. So you can think about CDL, critical digital literacy. As there's already this body of scholarship out there called critical pedagogy. You've got critical literacy. So they're it's basically critical literacy with a focus on technology. It's kind of where we're going with this book and with the class. But it's based largely on this earlier work. So here we have Janks talking about 4 aspects of critical literacy, teaching students to be more critical of the concept, I suppose, and also teachers that want to teach literacy to be more critical. So first is domination. So teaching students, and I would argue also the teachers, to be aware of how language works as a perpetuator, I guess, of inequality. Subtle things, not just some people lampoon this, saying, well, it's political correctness. Well, the truth is there's a lot of inequality that gets promoted by people subconsciously or unconsciously, just by the language that they use. And things of, I might say, for example, well, everyone's welcome. This is a completely equal seminar. Let's say you got a class seminar, right? And you say, it's perfectly fair because any student in the classroom can talk at any time. They can contribute freely. But then I might not be aware of certain dynamics in the classroom. For example, maybe the guys in the classroom talk a lot more than the women and interrupt the women a lot more. Maybe the women never contradict anything that the men say, but they contradict each other. So somebody that's really focused on this issue will really get in there and start studying that language to try to figure out how was it reproducing this dominant ideology, trying to make you aware of things that were unnoticed before. And then that's a big one, right? And then we have access, so just making these various forms available. So not just the dominant discourse, but bringing in all this other material for the students. And the diversity kicks in when you say, well, it's not just making it accessible, not just making it available, but looking at something like the students' own essays and saying, well, we're not going to regard these student contributions as somehow less legitimate, non-standard, informal, or whatever, and try to put them on a lower, pedestal than that standard discourse. But we want to say we want to respect those, recognize, as Rancière would say, the intelligence, the equal intelligence that went into making those documents. That's where the diversity kicks in, and then the design, I guess, is most critical for Cadenius, right? Because that's where you're having students take things apart, put things back together, exploring a range of modalities. So instead of just, one of the things I've done before in a composition classroom is say, and you've probably done this too, or had it, maybe you've been part of a project like this. We say, okay, write about this in an essay form. Now why don't you write a poem about this, or make a painting, or some other modality that the students have a lot more confidence using, right? And all of this ties together in a nice package, I guess, for Janks. Okay, so Schmier says that Mr. Cadenius missed a lot of opportunities. And I know a lot of you had talked about this in your nuggets. It kind of bothered, some people were bothered by this. I thought that she was a little harsh. Other people seem to think maybe she wasn't harsh enough. Actually, not sure if anybody said that, but that would be an interesting perspective. So anyway, I'll just, now that I've kind of gone over some of this material, I want you to think about this project Mr. Cadenius did and Schmier's reactions to it, and whether you think she was fair or not. Okay, so let's wrap this up with the sort of goal that Schmier leaves us with. So we need to help teachers to, quote, navigate conversations that open up, as opposed to shutting down diverse perspectives, as well as ways to address concerns that arise from parents. And this is interesting. You don't really think about parents that often unless you're in high school, a high school teacher or a grade school maybe. But yeah, I mean, they're part of the conversation too, right? So as well as ways to address concerns that arise from parents and administrators who themselves may be uncomfortable with particular issues and perspectives being discussed in the classroom. So, when I was reading this article and they were talking about the abortion issue and the PSA and how the Mr. Cadenius was really uncomfortable with this topic because it was I think this was a junior high or high school? I can't remember. But anyway, there was a concern about the sex in there and whether that was appropriate. He didn't want to get these students into trouble, probably didn't want to get himself into trouble. This idea of a taboo topic, and how to navigate that sort of minefield, you might say. So did Mr. Cadenius shut down some of these conversations? Or did he open them up? Because I don't know. I guess Schmier would say that his focus on the form of a PSA and saying, well, you can't put this in the video, you can't put that in the video, and also the fact, according to Schmier anyway, the students really didn't critically examined sort of their own beliefs about abortion. They didn't really get into I guess, a socialist, Marxist, maybe a feminist angle on it. Was that the fault of Mr. Cardenas? I don't. It's kind of difficult for me to answer that question. I don't really know. I'm just trying to think of what could he have done to open up more of those discussions without, or maybe he shouldn't even been concerned. Who cares if the administrators don't like it or the parents don't like it? Maybe he could have just said, well, that's their problem. I really want these students to explore this issue fully. Like I said, in college, it's less of a concern about parents. We probably piss a lot of parents off. It's kind of a routine that the college professors and classes get dragged through the mainstream media, right, for being too radical. Administrators, I do remember one time a dean addressing our department and saying that we shouldn't curse in the classroom. We should sort of clamp down on foul language in the classroom because it makes people uncomfortable. And I've seen some discussions. It'd be interesting to think about this in lieu of like this focus on safe zones or safe spaces in classrooms, and how do you maintain an teaching environment where everyone's comfortable and feels safe? Obviously you don't want somebody to ever feel unsafe, but at the same time, maybe there's a need sometimes for uncomfortable discussions. It's a huge issue, right? But anyway, I'll let you respond to this final point here, and see you next time.